The Cold War is often taught in a way that makes it feel much cleaner than it really was. People, they learn the factions, they learn the slogans, the timeline of events, the crises. They learn about the United States and the Soviet Union facing off for decades in the nuclear war. And that's really just the skeleton. It's not giving you the real political experience of the age. Because the Cold War wasn't just this rivalry between two superpowers. There have always been rivalries like this. It was a system of permanent crisis. It was a way of organizing politics, culture, economics, intelligence, military planning, and everyday consciousness around the idea that a catastrophe was always near enough to justify extraordinary readiness, extraordinary vigilance, and that could be taken far. That's the real subject. It's not about, for me, it's not simply communism versus capitalism, East versus West. It's not simply the diplomacy and the arms races and the espionage. Well, and that all is very interesting, but the deeper subject is what happens to a society when existential threat stops being a temporary emergency and becomes the normal atmosphere of political life. That changes everything, because most political systems can tolerate short emergencies. Most of them can. A war breaks out, the powers expand, dissent narrows, you have dissident voices rising up, the state is mobilizing, people can accept restrictions, and then eventually the emergency ends. And some of those powers are supposed to retract. That's the usual theory anyway. But the Cold War is not that kind of emergency. It lasts too long. It becomes a structure. It becomes more than an interruption. It's not a storm the system weathers and then leaves behind. It's a climate. And once that the crisis becomes a climate, the state power starts changing in deeper ways. And that's one of the central lessons for me of the Cold War itself. It's that if a government can persuade itself and its population that survival is always under threat, then the distinction between emergency measures and ordinary governance begins to erode. Extraordinary powers stop feeling extraordinary. Secrecy becomes normal. Surveillance becomes normal. Military spending becomes very baseline. The actions of the executive office, becomes very difficult to challenge because the dangers are always said to be too immediate, too global, too high stakes for, the ordinary slowness. And politics begins to speak in the language of necessity. And necessity is one of the most dangerous words in politics, in the political life. Because once leaders say something is necessary for survival, every other question gets weaker. Liberty becomes negotiable. Procedure becomes something irritating. Dissent becomes very suspect. Delay and the slow move of politics becomes dangerous. And all of this can happen without formal dictatorship. That's the important point. You do not need jackboots in every street for crisis politics to reshape a society. You just need a durable sense that history is permanently one step away from catastrophe, from disaster. That's what the Cold War created. And to understand why, we have to first acknowledge the scale of the fear involved. The Cold War is born out of a world that has already seen total war, World War II, genocide, firebombing. At the end there, atomic weapons. It was made by ideological extremism and just mass state mobilization on a scale that previous generations would have found almost unthinkable, right? And the Second World War does not end by making people confident in human restraint. It ends by proving how far industrial civilization can go when organized around survival and victory. Then almost immediately, instead of settling into peace, the world reorganizes into a new conflict, this time between powers that are not only militarily opposed to each other, but ideologically universal in their self-understanding, right? And that matters because the United States and the Soviet Union were not merely competing states with a border dispute or something. Each, in its own way, represented a total vision of social order. Each thought the future belonged to its model. Each feared that the other, if it expanded far enough, would not simply alter the balance of power, but transform the shape of civilization itself. And that's what gives the Cold War its existential quality. It's not that, one side might gain territory or whatever. It's that one side may define history from here on out. And that kind of fear creates very powerful politics. In the American case, especially, which is what we're talking about. Though this is not only true of America, right? The Cold War helps create what people call the national security state, or as at least I'm calling it. And the phrase can sound very vague if you're not careful. It should not. It means, really simply, that military planning, intelligence institutions, the executive, the secrecy of the executive, alliance systems, technological mobilization, these covert actions, and ideological vigilance become permanent organs of government rather than some temporary wartime object that is kind of improvised, which is a huge shift at this time. We don't realize it now, but that's a huge shift. Because before the 20th century, most republics and constitutional systems at least like to imagine that war was, they played out in episodes, and that large military concentrations or secretive bureaucracies were suspicious. After the Cold War begins, the United States in particular starts learning how to govern as if peace and war are no longer clearly separate. The state does not demobilize in the old sense. It remains on watch. It builds vast standing capacities. And intelligence services become very central, right? The defense budgets balloon in size. Planning for catastrophe becomes like this very constant thing that we're always on top of. And when this happens, liberty, it stops negotiating with the state that occasionally becomes dangerous in wartime. It's negotiating with a state that permanently is structured by anticipation of danger, which are two very different things, because a government built around permanent anticipation does not need open war at every moment to justify their expansion. The possibility of war becomes enough. The possibility of infiltration becomes enough. The possibility of surprise or a surprise attack becomes enough. The possibility of some sort of ideological subversion becomes enough. And these threats become detached from immediate events and are turned into a standing rationale for the governments, for the state. And that's one of the reasons the Cold War is so important for understanding modern politics, especially more broadly. It teaches governments how to live off fear of the future. They don't need to say that a catastrophe is happening right now. They only need to say catastrophe could happen. And if you're not already mobilized for it, then we're just too late. And that's immensely powerful. And one of the earliest examples of this, and clearest examples of this mindset, is NSC 68, right? The American policy document from 1950s, sometime in the 50s, I think. And what matters about it, it's not just the details of the military buildup. It's the basic psychological and potential logic of it. It's framing the Soviet challenge in sweeping civilizational terms. And it's pushing towards large-scale, long-term mobilization. And the argument isn't for a single campaign or narrowly bounded response. It's for a society reorganized around a sustained struggle. And that's crisis politics evolving into a real solid doctrine. And it becomes real with the Korean War. And the Korean War, it's one of the most important histories, the most important moments in the whole history of Cold War state power, because it's converting containment theory, or the containment policy, from a strategy into a mobilized system, right? The conflict is no longer just theoretical or diplomatic. It is military, costly and global in its implication, and open-ended, because the United States expands its defense commitments here. It normalizes a higher military footing, and it deepens the logic that communist advance anywhere may require response everywhere, right? That's another major feature of the permanent crisis politics, which is the diffusion of stakes. Because once a state starts thinking this way, no conflict stays local for too long, if that makes sense, right? A civil war somewhere else becomes a test of resolve. A revolution somewhere else becomes a signal of world historical movement. A coup somewhere else becomes very strategic to the overall game, the strategic node, right? The map fills with all these places that matter, not because of their own immediate significance to ordinary citizens, but because they are imagined as fronts in an unlimited struggle. That has enormous consequences for both state power and moral reasoning. Because if every point on the map is just part of one giant existential contest, then intervention just becomes easier to justify, right? Secrecy becomes easier to justify. The intelligence agencies and their covert actions become easier to justify. Support for brutal allies becomes easier to justify. A permanent crisis mindset doesn't like ambiguity. It does not like local complexity. It likes alignment, and it asks one question above everything else. Whose side is this on? They look at something and they ask, whose side is this on? And that question is simplifying the world in a dangerous way. And the Cold War encourages a habit of moral compression. It's putting people in countries and organizations and everything into boxes, countries, movements, right? The intellectuals, labor unions, the anti-colonial struggles, the student protests, and just cultural figures even, all get interpreted, not, obviously not in their own terms, but through the lens of alignment. Are they helping us or helping them? Are they destabilizing the free world, or are they stabilizing it? Are they useful, suspicious, or dangerous? And politics, once it's organized that way, any sort of nuance becomes a liability, right? Complexity starts looking very weak. It's not something that people want. And that affects liberty at home just as much as power abroad, because when a state lives inside existential polarity, internal dissent becomes a lot harder to interpret, fairly at least. Because if the enemy is not merely another country, but rather an ideological force capable of infiltration, then disagreement inside society can start feeling like internal contamination. And that's where McCarthyism and the larger anti-communist culture become so important, right? People reduce McCarthyism to one loud senator, thus the name, but the broader phenomenon is deeper. It's a climate in which suspicion becomes patriotic, accusation becomes a career, and civil liberties weaken. Not always because laws explicitly abolish them, but because fear changes the moral burden of proof. And that's worth lingering on, because a free society usually claims to tolerate dissent, even unpopular dissent. But under permanent crisis politics, dissent is no longer judged only by its arguments. It is judged by its possible effects in a world of total struggle, right? If a professor criticizes policy, he's offering democratic scrutiny, or is he trying to give weakening resolve? Is he weakening his resolve? If a writer attacks military policy, is the writer exercising their free conscience or giving comfort to the enemy? And if a worker organizes militantly, is it labor politics or is it some sort of subversion? And when you have a threat that's existential and indefinite, the answer increasingly depends on suspicion rather than evidence. And that's how liberty erodes without some sort of dramatic constitutional collapse. The laws may remain largely intact, the courts may still function, elections still happen, but fear alters the social and institutional interpretation of freedom. Rights are still there in principle, yet their exercise becomes more dangerous, more stigmatized, and more easily associated with disloyalty. And that is one of the most enduring mechanisms of crisis politics. It moralizes conformity. People don't merely obey because they're forced. They obey because they are taught that deviation under these conditions is irresponsible, it's selfish, naive, or dangerous. And once a political culture really absorbs that logic, repression, it no longer needs to be total to be effective. People start censoring themselves in advance. Institutions preemptively narrow discourse. Employers purge risks. Universities watch reputations. Media adopts, patriotic filters. The coercion is real, but much of it is very ambient. And this is what happens in the United States in one way. And in the Soviet Union, of course, the structure is very different. And we think of it as much harder in many respects. The Soviet state is already much more openly centralized, repressive, and ideological. The Cold War there reinforces the militarization, the propaganda, and the surveillance, and the priority of state security in a society where the space for formal liberty is already far narrower. But even here, what matters is the same larger principle, and it's that a permanent existential threat legitimizes the concentration of authority. It teaches the state to speak as if survival dissolves objection. And again, that is not always false. Sometimes the threat is real. The point is not that governments invent danger out of nothing. The point is that real danger, once prolonged, changes the structure of justification, right? The Soviet Union already did face strategic encirclement fears. They did. The United States really did face a hostile rival with global ambitions and nuclear capability. The problem is not that the crisis was imaginary. The problem is that the crisis becomes the solvent that wears away any normal restraint. And that's why I'm not anti-security or anti-state in some very simplistic way. States do need to defend themselves. The world can be dangerous. Nuclear weapons aren't fake. Espionage is real. Rival powers do interfere. It would be childish to deny that. But the real question is harder. What happens when the need for security becomes the master concept under which all other goods must justify themselves? That is the Cold War problem. Because once security becomes supreme, liberty no longer appears as something foundational. It appears as conditional, something to be protected when it's possible, maybe restricted and narrowed a bit when necessary, postponed when it's risky, and interpreted through danger rather than the principle of liberty. And the longer that condition lasts, the more likely it is that people stop seeing the narrowing as temporary at all. And that's where the idea of emergency normalization becomes central. During the Cold War, practices that might have once seemed extraordinary become very routine, right? The intelligence agencies expand. The covert operations become a standard instrument of policy. The surveillance capacities deepen. The classification systems grow. The executive branch gains enormous latitude in foreign affairs. Congress reacts after the fact. But citizens live under immediate reaction, right? The school children are drilling for annihilation, literally, with the bomb drills. Entire industries become fused to defense. Research universities tie themselves to military contracts. The whole society begins orienting around preparedness. And that has a deep effect on the political imagination. A society shaped by permanent crisis begins to think of strength as the ability to act quickly, secretly, and globally. Deliberation starts to feel a lot more slow, and transparency about things starts to feel like a risk factor, like it's dangerous. Public consent starts to look very impractical too, in a world where enemies may strike suddenly, they may subvert invisibly and exploit openness. And in other words, constitutional values begin to look like luxuries precisely when they matter most. And this isn't unique, it's not unique to the Cold War, but the Cold War makes it durable, it makes it last. And it does something else too, it merges the state with a broader security culture. You can't understand Cold War America, for example, only through the formal institutions. You have to understand the surrounding psychology, the duck and cover drills, the bomb shelters, anti-communist education, the whole patriotic spectacle, loyalty oaths, science being mobilized for defense, the family life coded as part of ideological stability. The crisis of the Cold War is not just the military, it becomes civilizational and intimate. People are not only living under the state, they internalize its emergency horizon in their own lives. And that's one of the reasons nuclear weapons matter so much here, because nuclear war intensifies crisis politics to an almost godlike level, right? Traditional war at least leaves room for distance, duration, and unevenness. Nuclear war threatens totality. It threatens everyone. And suddenly it creates a world in which governments prepare for an event that would likely destroy normal politics altogether. And yet, because that event may never occur, preparation becomes permanent without any sort of resolution. And think about what that does psychologically. You're asking entire societies to live in the shadow of possible extinction for decades. And that's not just a strategic condition, that's a mode of consciousness. It makes fear very abstract, chronic, atmospheric. It's not panic or calm, it's alertness prolonged without any sort of closure ever. And that condition is particularly useful to states, because chronic fear makes large systems of management feel very reasonable, right? If annihilation is always one miscalculation away, then every instrument of anticipation becomes a lot easier to defend, right? The experts gain a lot more prestige. The secret knowledge gains prestige. The technical planning does. The citizens are told, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that the complexity and danger of the age exceed ordinary judgment. And that's how liberty can be displaced, not only by force, but by expertise itself. And that's an underrated part. That part is an underrated part of Cold War power. Permanent crisis does not only produce logic, police logic. It's not only moving it around. It also produces technocratic logic, massive military planning, nuclear strategy, game theory, area studies, all this intelligent analysis, development theory, behavioral science, system management. All of these expand in a world where governing the crisis becomes the model task. The state starts to rely not only on coercive tools, but on an expert class who can model, measure, and predict, and manage risk. Again, some of this is necessary, but necessity has consequences, right? Once a government becomes deeply entangled with expert management of existential threat, then public life can begin to feel less like self-rule and more like supervised stability, right? Citizens are not openly ruled as children exactly, but they are often treated as people too exposed to danger or too uninformed about complexity to guide the system directly. And that has a paradoxical effect on democracy. Cold War democracies become more electorally active in some ways, more rhetorically democratic, more mobilized around ideological identity, but they can also become narrower in the range of what is treated as serious, loyal, or safe. The system remains democratic in procedure, while crisis reduces the depth of permissible contest in substance itself, in reality. And that's why the Cold War should make people wary of taking elections alone as proof of political freedom, right? A society can still vote and still be profoundly shaped by security imperatives that narrow the imagination, empower the executive, and just stigmatize entire areas of dissent. Now, I don't think that means any of the crisis politics were, omnipotent. There was dissent. There were real civil liberty victories back then. Courts, they pushed back. Activists, judges, writers, religious leaders, and citizens all challenged the logic of secrecy, war, and the repression and such. The United States did not become the Soviet Union. That distinction matters. But it is precisely because the system remained partly free that the Cold War's effects are so intrusive into our own lives, and they tell us so much. You can watch a society retain constitutional form while gradually teaching itself to live inside continuous exception. And that is a much more realistic danger for many states than an outright dictatorship. And we can turn outward again because permanent crisis politics also changes the morality of foreign policy. Once the world is interpreted as a field of existential alignment, right, states begin supporting things they would otherwise publicly condemn. The torturers become allies, dictators become partners, coups become necessities, and elections become kind of optional if the wrong side might win. Human rights are very selective now. It's not this all isn't because people in power stop caring about morality. It's because morality gets subordinated to the survival logic. The question becomes not just what is just in itself, but what is tolerable in the struggle. And that's one of the darkest effects of permanent crisis. It corrodes standards by making compromise with ugliness seem responsible. The United States does this. The Soviet Union does this in its own ways. The smaller states trapped in the contest do it too. Whole regions become laboratories for the logic that existential struggle excuses indirect brutality. The Cold War is full of places where liberty is defended rhetorically through alliances with repression. That should make us suspicious whether states speak as if the defense of freedom automatically purifies their means. Because under permanent crisis politics, liberty becomes sacred and also a negotiable reality. And the contradiction sits at the center of the whole age itself. And then there's the military-industrial side of it. Eisenhower warned about this. He warned about the military-industrial complex. And that part gets quoted too lazily. But it matters because it points to another consequence of long emergency. And it's that institutions built for crisis begin developing their own crisis, their own inertia. The defense industries, military bureaucracies, intelligence networks, the research systems, the contractors, the strategic planners, and congressional interests all become intertwined. And once that happens, the crisis is not only external, it becomes embedded in domestic political economy. Large parts of the state and society now depend materially on the continuation of preparedness. That doesn't make the threats fake. Doesn't mean the threats are fake. It means the machinery of all of the military-industrial complex requires self-interest, and it works in its own self-interest. And self-interested crisis systems are very hard to unwind, and that's why Cold War politics survives, even when particular tensions shift, because the logic is bigger than any one event. It becomes a habit. It trains institutions to expect danger, to justify their expansion, and resist contraction. And in that sense, permanent crisis politics can outlive the specific crisis that created it. And that may be one of the most important lessons of all, because even after the Cold War formally ends, many of its habits still remain. The surveillance infrastructure there from the Cold War remains. The executive secrecy remains normal. The interventionist instincts persist. security language continues to dominate politics and policy today. The new threats are replacing the old ones, but the grammar of endless emergency is still here. It's always available. The Cold War is not just a historical period. It is one of the major schools in which modern states learned how to govern through sustained threat. And we should talk about citizens too, because states are not the only actor in this. What does permanent crisis do to ordinary political character? It does at least 4 things in my mind. First, it encourages dependency on guardians. If total danger is here and it's technical, people are going to look to experts, towards agencies and the executives. The citizenship becomes a lot more passive in one register, even when the rhetoric remains very patriotic and active. Second, it rewards simplification. Nuance feels very dangerous in a world of total struggle. People want clarity. They don't want complexity. And that makes ideological life dumber, for a lack of words, a lot harsher. Third, it puts people in, it reduces people's expectations of liberty. Not always openly, but very gradually. They begin treating surveillance, secrecy, censorship, or, exclusion as very unfortunate but normal. And fourth, it can generate exhaustion. Permanent mobilization is tiring, right? A population asked to live forever in crisis eventually oscillates between fear and numbness. And that numbness is politically useful too. People stop asking whether extraordinary measures are still extraordinary. And that last point, I can't, understate it too much. Crisis politics is not sustained only by panic. It is often sustained by fatigue. People get used to a very strange baseline. The bomb that can end all of civilization becomes a background. The intelligence state becomes a background. The security apparatus becomes background. And once danger becomes background noise, critique weakens because the abnormal has been metabolized into ordinary life. And I think the strongest way to put this all is that the Cold War teaches that existential threat changes liberty less by openly abolishing it, rather than by organizing the conditions under which liberty has to justify itself. That is key. Liberty does not disappear. It gets put on the defensive. It must prove that it will not endanger survival. It must prove it will not weaken morale. It must prove it will not help the enemy. And it must prove that it can fit inside a security first order. And once liberty is permanently forced into that posture, state-driven power grows not only outward towards its enemies, but inward. It becomes more secretive, more anticipatory, more expert-driven, more global, and more embedded, and more difficult to challenge without sounding disloyal or even naive. And I should also say this, because some degree of mobilization was unavoidable. The Soviet threat to the Americans was real. The nuclear weapons were real. The world was very dangerous. And the lesson isn't that governments should have done nothing. The lesson is that even real threats can produce patterns of governance that outlast necessity and teach states to prefer emergency logic. And that's why the Cold War remains so relevant. Not because we're still in 1962 or whatever, but because the problem it created never went away. Modern states still know how to speak the language of total danger. They still know how to justify extraordinary measures through permanent readiness. They still know how to narrow liberty in the name of survival while preserving the outward forms of normal politics. The Cold War didn't invent that logic. But it perfected it on a civilizational scale. The Cold War mattered not only because it pitted two superpowers against each other, but because it taught modern states how to turn existential threat into a durable political environment in which liberty was tolerated conditionally and power was expanded permanently. That's the real legacy. The normalization of emergency as a way of governing. And once a society has learned to live that way, it becomes very difficult to remember where crisis ends and ordinary freedom is supposed to begin.